In our day, as in all previous generations, people are strongly encouraged or expected to trust in expert opinion. Trust the science, trust your doctor, trust the scholars, trust the authorities. The alternative, it's often insinuated, is to be on the fringe of accepted scholarship, or to be a science denier, a conspiracy theorist, a bigoted fundie, or something equally scorn-worthy. I think that this approach to knowledge is both naive and dangerous. Many scholarly opinions, if carefully scrutinized, will seem to be based on just a slender thread of evidence. And yet, for whatever reasons, these opinions become ascendant among academics. And once that happens, it's very difficult to get any traction with alternative opinions, even if those opinions are just as credible. Let me also disabuse you of any silly notion that scholars are somehow above the fray, more neutral, less agenda-driven, less prone to peer pressure. Academics are just ordinary people, and in many ways, they're actually a lot worse. Like everyone else, they're driven by biases, agendas, and personal predilections. But unlike most people, they usually pretend to be completely neutral, speaking with language and a temperament that sound more objective and free from any agendas. And they often refuse to speak candidly about their own deeper philosophical and ideological views because they don't want people to think that their scholarship has any kind of motive behind it. In this respect, and in many others, academics are quite cowardly. I've often said that the three most cowardly people in the world are politicians, artists, and academics. Academia is actually structured in such a way as to attract cowards. If you want to work your way up in the academic world, you need to learn how to play by the rules. You can't just go around biting people like some obnoxious gadfly. That's not collegial. Successful academics figure this out early on. They learn how to conform, how to think and act more like their peers, and how to avoid and not stir up any unnecessary tensions. And that, in my opinion, is why a lot of really bad ideas manage to flourish in academia and only die a very slow death. For example, in secular institutions, there's a lot of pressure not to sound too conservative or too traditional. In fact, in most secular institutions, especially the higher-rated ones, there's practically no chance that you'll find an evangelical scholar as a faculty member in any of the humanities. This is because they don't fall in line on a number of issues. It doesn't matter how many articles or books a person has published or how highly regarded he or she is within a given field. In the American academies, if someone holds the wrong opinions about certain issues, he will most certainly be blackballed and will very likely be terminated, or just never hired in the first place. Now, I should emphasize here that I'm talking about the American academies. Other countries are probably similar to what we have here in America, but I can't really comment as much on what happens in other countries. I can comment on the UK, since I did my PhD over there, and keep up to some extent with who's teaching at which universities. The academies of the United Kingdom seem much less bigoted than American academies. I say this because some very well-known evangelicals hold positions at the universities of Aberdeen, Edinburgh, St. Andrews, Cambridge, Oxford, and so on. In the United States, the situation is very different. Here, the academies are very hostile to evangelicals and to conservatives more generally. This is partly the fault of evangelicals themselves, I think, because in the early 1900s, many of them withdrew from the universities and formed their own seminaries and Bible colleges. And so now we've got this situation where academics from secular institutions just feel free to ignore evangelicals or interact with mere caricatures. In this kind of environment, I hope you can appreciate why consensus opinion doesn't seem very meaningful. not just to evangelicals, but to other conservatives as well. In the academy, there's a lot of groupthink. For example, while it's probably true that most academics in American universities would deny that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, the truth is that they haven't actually given much thought to the matter and couldn't really tell you whether there are any good counter-arguments to this viewpoint. They just believe what they do because they know that this is what they're supposed to believe. My advice would be, whenever you hear someone appealing to a consensus view among so-called experts as a rationale for believing something or performing some action, you should always take this as a red flag. It's really nothing more than an appeal to authority, which is a logical fallacy. You should therefore never regard it as a satisfying answer, or as a cue for you to stop asking questions, or to stop thinking critically. Quite the opposite. It's precisely when you hear this kind of answer that you should start asking more questions and start thinking even more critically. People appeal to expert opinions for a few different reasons. First, because they don't actually know why they believe what they do, and therefore can't articulate it for themselves. Identifying one's own views with those of some esteemed scholar or group of scholars can give a person a sense of great intellectual satisfaction without having to be intellectually enlightened. Second, people appeal to scholarly consensuses because they know that if the arguments were to be clearly laid out, they would sound rather weak. So it's just easier not to discuss them. They know that when most people hear about a supposed expert opinion or a consensus of scholars believing in something, they either won't think to challenge it, or they'll at least feel too intimidated to do so publicly. To put it another way, appealing to expert opinions or an alleged consensus among scholars, doctors, or whatever is a way to scare off any would-be naysayers. That's because most people believe that to question or reject expert opinion or a scholarly consensus is to question the highest and most venerated kind of authority in our culture and world. But I'm not most people. I believe that nothing is unquestionable, no matter who or how many happen to accept it. I believe this way about everything, and I could spend hours explaining why. But I'll stick here to the field of biblical studies because, as an academic, this has tended to be my own area of concentration. So let's reflect for a moment on some of the older scholarly consensuses in biblical studies. It was once a scholarly consensus that writing hadn't been invented by the time of Moses, and that the people referred to in the Bible as Hittites didn't exist. Many scholars claim that King David was a mythological figure. It was also once widely held among scholars that the essence of Jesus' message was the universal fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of men. It was also widely believed among New Testament scholars that the Gospel of John had been composed in the mid to late 2nd century AD. For much of the 20th century, it was widely believed among New Testament scholars that when Jesus spoke about the coming Son of Man, he was talking about someone other than himself. Also popular among scholars in the 20th century was the view that Jesus' portrayal in the Gospels was based on a widely known divine man construct. Another very widely held scholarly view of the 20th century was that the story of Jesus' incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension had been based on a Gnostic Redeemer myth. Most historians of the 19th century regarded Josephus's Testimonium Flavianum as a complete forgery. It was once widely held among scholars that certain criteria, such as the criteria of dissimilarity and multiple attestation, could be used to establish with confidence the historicity of certain sayings and events in Jesus' life. And for pretty much all of the 20th century, it was the scholarly consensus that when Matthew and Luke composed their Gospels, they relied independently on two sources, Mark and Q. I could go on. All of these views were once very popular, and many of them even dominant amongst biblical scholars. Now, every single one of them is either seriously questioned or dismissed as no longer credible. So when I hear people appealing to scholarly consensuses, I usually just roll my eyes. If someone can't make an argument to stand on its own merits without propping it up with appeals to authority, I don't think we should accept it.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Now, I know that people are going to respond here by saying that none of us can master every topic. So if we want to function in this world, we have no real choice but to trust in expert opinion. I'll grant that we can't master every topic, but that doesn't mean that we just have to take other people's word about everything. Many disciplines are very hierarchical and compartmentalized. Others are so specialized that they're basically unaccountable. This effectively allows for a few so-called experts to set the parameters on what counts as acceptable thought. In this respect, academia often operates a bit like the government, or perhaps even like a religious cult. I don't think we can progress intellectually if we're operating under such a model. So while it's true that nobody can be an expert in every field of learning, this should have no relevance to the deeper philosophical question of whether we should have the freedom to question what we're being told to think. People are endowed with the ability to reason, some of them anyway, so they don't need to be told what to believe. They deserve to see evidence and hear arguments, and they deserve the right to withhold judgment until such evidence and arguments are forthcoming in what they regard as a free and open forum. And they deserve the right to form their own judgments afterwards. People have the ability to research and learn about things, even in areas in which they have no formal training, assuming ideas aren't being censored and suppressed. So I'm sorry, Mr. Scholar, Mr. Expert, if that bothers you, but you may not be as relevant and important as you think you are. People don't actually need you to decide for them what they're allowed to believe. I reject the idea that we can only question the so-called expert opinions within a given field if we ourselves are experts within that field. I will always want to see evidence and hear arguments, even if I'm not an expert. And if I ask for evidence and arguments, and all you can do is point me to some scholarly consensus, I'll just assume that you either don't know what you're talking about, or do know, and are afraid to talk about it because you know that if it's openly presented, it won't seem so unquestionable. Sadly, many people don't understand that quoting scholars and offering arguments are two very different things. Quoting scholars as a justification for holding some opinion is really just a form of rhetoric, and is often just another expression of identity politics. It's like saying, "I'm with the smart kids, you're not." So this type of justification may have some psychological pull to it, but it's not an actual argument, much less a valid one. It's just a way of structuring power around a certain social identity, the scholar identity, or the smart person identity, because it creates the impression that if you're not in alignment with some alleged scholarly opinion, you just aren't very credible, and you don't have any authority in what you're saying. Now, it may well be that some person isn't very credible and has no authority to speak on a given topic. I wouldn't want to suggest that everyone's opinions are equally valid, no matter how much research he's done or how cogent his reasoning is. My point is just that the validity of someone's opinion doesn't hinge on whether it lines up with some supposed scholarly consensus. Indeed, scholarly consensuses are notoriously difficult to define. I'm often amused at how frequently people will appeal to scholarly consensuses. Anyone who's tried to write an academic article or a book will know that scholars disagree about almost everything, especially in the field of biblical studies. And even when they do seem to agree generally about something, they will disagree about some finer point, which they still regard as very important and distinctive. Another complication is that people tend to judge consensuses by the types of scholars that they happen to have read or interacted with. But this is often just a reflection of one's own reading preferences and biases, not an objective measure of what some majority of scholars happens to believe. And so you should never quote a scholar or appeal to some scholarly consensus in order to prove an argument. In fact, I would even discourage people from quoting scholars in order to buttress one's argument. An argument ought to stand on its own merits, full stop. And if that's true, it shouldn't really matter how many esteemed scholars happen to believe in it. My usual approach is only to quote a scholar if I'm using him as a sparring partner. In other words, if I'm disagreeing with him, or if I'm using the argument of another scholar and I'm trying to give him credit for it. I rarely quote a scholar's opinion without explaining why he holds it, even if he happens to agree with me and it makes me look good to say that some other reputable scholar holds the same view as I do about something. Again, that's just rhetoric. It's not an actual argument. If you quote a scholar or appeal to a consensus opinion, you should always explain why this opinion is held. That way the opinion can still be judged on its own merits, not because some respected scholar or group of scholars happens to agree with it. This has been a public service announcement